Hi, we're now looking at planning, which is our second phase of 4. So far we've looked at initiation. In the future we'll look at execution and evaluation, but now planning. So this phase has got quite a lot to it. There'll be several videos on it like initiation really. Today we're just looking at what happens during this phase and to look at what a project plan is, which is really the key bit of this phase. So to recap, so far we looked at initiation. Really, initiation is about starting to think about what you want to do. So you've got some idea of what you want to create in your project. Maybe you're creating a product, maybe you're creating a service, you're doing some action, and during initiation you're starting to think about what's going on. You're starting to set objectives and generally think about what you want to achieve. Now in planning, we're actually taking it a bit further and starting to think in more detail about what is going to be required to meet the objectives set during initiation. So what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? We're trying to actually make this idea into a reality by doing some planning first of all. So when I think of planning, I think of, say, an architect doing like a blueprint for a house. Maybe they're starting to sketch out what's going to happen. They're not actually building the house yet, they're just thinking about what the layout is going to be, what materials they're going to use. They're not actually doing it yet, they're just mapping it out. And planning is really important because I've been part of an IT project which we kind of had initiation, we were starting to think about our objectives, but we essentially skipped planning and jumped straight into execution, and it meant we didn't really have any idea on what specifically we were doing. We had no blueprint to work from. Having a detailed plan means that everyone is on the same page, everyone knows what they're doing, and generally you're going to have fewer mistakes and it'll be an easier process if you do planning properly. So that is what planning is. The name gives it away quite a lot. In terms of our inputs from initiation, so the inputs are going to be the outputs from initiation. From this, we've got first of all a feasibility report. Now this report is basically saying how we can do our project, how it's possible to do it. So we've got some user requirements and we've got some constraints, requirements being what we need and constraints being what we can't do. So things like a budget, a timescale, we can't break that. And we know from this report, from our previous work, that we can do it, it's possible to do, and we know how we can approach a project. So we've got some idea of how we're going to meet our requirements and not break our constraints. We also will have considered the legal issues, so legislation being another word for a law, essentially. We know what laws that are relevant to our project, we know how not to break them in our plan. And in terms of our third input, next steps, which is quite vague, really this is us knowing kind of what we need to do. And this will often be derived from our objectives, which are hopefully smart, and also our success criteria, how we know what we're doing is a good thing. Okay, so we've got our inputs, which are all from initiation. Now in terms of our outputs, we've got, first of all, a project and test plan. Really, the main purpose of planning is, surprise, creating a project plan. So we are creating this document which is going to tell us what we need to do to achieve our objectives. A test plan we'll look at as well a bit later as well. So this project plan is telling us what we need to do, the order it needs to be. The order is so important, and also when we need to do it by. The constraint is always going to be timescale, and so we need to make sure we finish our project in a decent amount of time that fits our constraint. Okay, so let's focus on project plan because that's really our main output from this phase. So based on our objectives from our first phase, initiation, we can start to figure out what individual tasks need to be done to create our project. Unless our project is really, really simple, we're going to need to do several, if not loads, of individual tasks, so just some job to complete our project. So for example, sticking to my train example of Crossrail, so a new train line across London, examples of tasks would include building the trains, teaching the drivers, making sure the drivers can use the new trains, building the stations is fairly important. This is quite a fancy station in Canary Wharf, and also making the tunnels, so boring the tunnels, drilling through the tunnels to allow the trains to go through eventually. So 4 example tasks. Each one could be broken down a lot more. This is just an example to get us started. So these are some tasks we'll start to think about during planning. One really important word regarding planning is concurrency. So this word really means at the same time. So some tasks can be completed at the same time as other tasks. And if a task can be completed at the same time in parallel, with another task, we can say that task is concurrent with the other task. So for example, out of my 4 example tasks, I would argue that building the trains, boring the tunnels and building the stations can all be done in parallel. You don't need to have a tunnel made to build a train in a factory. Likewise, the station is usually above ground. You can build the station while you are doing the tunnel. I think that's correct, it's just an example. But we would say each of these tasks can be done concurrently, so can be done at the same time. And that's important to know because we can save a lot of time by doing each one at the same time as opposed to one after the other. You can't really teach the drivers until you have some trains and some tunnels and some stations. So that links to another key word, which is dependency. So some tasks we say can be done in parallel, other tasks require a previous task to have been done first. So in this example, we've got our concurrent tasks here, but teaching the drivers requires each of these to have been done first. So we would say the task, teaching the drivers, is dependent on building the stations, boring the tunnels and building the trains. We need to have done these first before we teach the drivers, otherwise they're going to be sat not doing anything, they've got nothing to practice on. So this consideration, this organising of our concurrent and dependent tasks, figuring out which ones can be done in parallel, which ones need another task to be done first, this whole process is planning out what we call the project's workflow. So workflow being another key word, workflow meaning really the order we are going to conduct our tasks in. The order is often essential, right? I mean, if you're making a cake, for example, if you add the sugar after you have taken the cake out of the oven, the whole thing is going to taste awful because your sugar needs to go inside the cake, it needs to get baked, otherwise you're just going to have loads of raw sugar on top of the cake, which is not going to taste very nice. So the order matters. If we get the order wrong during planning, it means later during execution we're going to really struggle to make our project work. So an example project plan might be something like this, and we'll look at in the next video how we might actually display the plan. But here just visually we've got, say, boring the tunnels first. We've then got, let's say these two are done concurrently, let's say the tunnels isn't done concurrently, let's say these two are, as our second task essentially, done in parallel. Then we teach the drivers and we will end with a question mark, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can see for each task I have assigned a date, so we've got some deadline assigned in our plan. That's really important, otherwise the project can drag on a long time. And that would be our workflow. So the workflow being the order we are doing. So 1, 2, 3 and 4 is our workflow, and that is considering our concurrency down here and also dependency. So teaching the drivers is dependent on these two tasks. These two tasks are dependent on actually having the tunnels in the first place, in just this instance. So this question mark here, number 4 on our task list, is contingency time. So contingency time is a really, I would say, essential task to plan in to your project plan. And really the task is no task. So a contingency time is a set of time which does not have any task allocated to it. So here we've got 8 months in this example allocated to nothing. Essentially this time is free in case there is an issue with another task. Say building the trains takes a few months longer than expected. This is going to delay the drivers because they're dependent, and it's going to delay the project unless we have some time built in to use up in case something else occurs. So you can never quite predict what's going to happen. This time is set aside in case something unpredictable does occur, and so we don't deliver the project late, we still have some time to rectify it. So a project plan is the main bulk of our phase, but not the only thing we are producing. We're also going to produce a test plan in this phase. So a test plan is basically a list of all of the tests you will be doing, so will being a key word here, in the next phase. And these tests are going to make sure that you have met these requirements and also met the constraints, or not broken the constraints. So really important, otherwise you don't really know how successful your project has been until you test your work. And so it's really important to understand that the actual testing is not happening now. We are testing it during execution, at the end of execution really. We need to have made our trains and stations and tunnels before we can test them. Right now, we're just planning what we are going to test in the future. And doing the planning now before you actually do it means you know exactly what you're going to do and you don't miss off any requirements or constraints. Often test plans are in the form of a table, and they are usually directly related to a requirement. So for example here, my first test, which is planned, is based on the requirement that trains will be high speed. I'm being more specific in my success criterion, so I'm saying that they need to exceed 160 miles per hour to be high speed. And so if this is true, if I test it and it's true, I've successfully met this requirement. And so my test might be, I'm going to try and get it to go as fast as possible on an empty track. That might be my test, quite a simple test really. And then I'll have a column maybe saying, have you passed it? Has this criterion been met? If it has, perfect. If it hasn't, we can iterate and go back and fix it to make the train faster or do some other alteration. Like I say, we're not actually doing the test now, we'll do the test in execution, we're just thinking about it right now. So this column will be left empty for the time being. And our final task to do during planning is a phase review. So like all phases, we have a phase review, looking back to see what we did well, what we did badly, maybe we need to go back and change something before we move on. So the sort of questions you'll ask at this meeting will be, have I got a detailed project and test plan? Have I made it detailed enough? Can I follow it directly in execution? Have you got a constraints list? So one of the outputs is the constraints list, which came from initiation. You may have changed it a little bit, so you need to make sure that it's been changed and is still appropriate. And really the key one is, have you got enough information in your plans to be able to begin work in the next phase on your creation, your product, your service, whatever you're doing. And so if this is all fine, if your project phase has gone well, we can move on to the next one, which is execution. If not, we have to go back and repeat a task, and this is called iteration. So our phase review is the last thing we do before moving on to the next phase. We need to make sure everything is perfect before we can move on.